After seeing a ton of discourse online, Reddit, videos, Twitter posts, all sorts of things over whether Final Fantasy XVI really is a Final Fantasy or not, instead of arguing or making a point to say that it is one, I decided to take a look at some of the ways that Final Fantasy XVI is influenced by previous games in the franchise. Hello there everybody, my name is Joesephyr, and take a journey with me as we talk about the combat system, the story, the setting, the characters, all sorts of different influences that previous games in the Final Fantasy franchise have had on Final Fantasy XVI. So we'll start with the obvious one, the elephant in the room. Final Fantasy XVI is very clearly heavily influenced by Final Fantasy XIV, which makes a lot of sense, seeing as Final Fantasy XIV is developed by Creative Business Unit 3, which of course also make Final Fantasy XVI. The easiest comparisons I can make between 14 and 16 are its structure, the way in which quests are carried out, side quests, main quests, all sorts of things like that are very, very akin to that you would see in Final Fantasy XIV, which is an interesting structure given that Final Fantasy XIV is an MMORPG and Final Fantasy XVI is an action-heavy single-player RPG. Speaking of the action-heavy style of combat that Final Fantasy XVI provides, one of the biggest games that 16 draws from, and honestly the game that kind of inspired me to make this video in the first place, because it's one of my favourite Final Fantasies, is Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V has had a lot of influence on Final Fantasy XVI that perhaps doesn't appear apparent on the surface, but it's a very interesting choice, especially after having seen an interview conducted with the creative director and scenario writer Kazutoyo Mahiro, combat director Ryota Suzuki, and director Hiroshi Takai with IGN before the release of Final Fantasy XVI, which all three of these creative minds cited Final Fantasy V as one of their favourite Final Fantasy games. This is particularly interesting because Final Fantasy V, when it was originally released on the Super Nintendo back in the 90s, never actually got released outside of Japan. And now that we have gotten to play it through the advanced versions, the Pixel Remaster versions, all sorts of different versions of Final Fantasy V that have come out later in the West, it's interesting to see quite how influential it was over people that were lead developers on Final Fantasy XVI. The combat in Final Fantasy XVI may, on the surface, look like it has no ground in Final Fantasy history whatsoever, but when you look at the way the icons translate to the job systems from previous games like Final Fantasy 3, 5, 10-2 and beyond, you can start to piece together where the influences from those games come in. I mentioned Final Fantasy V in particular because you have the ability to kind of take skills you've learned from one icon and equip them onto another, which gives you a very customizable way for you to build your build, as it were. And Final Fantasy V presents this in a very similar way, and it's actually one of the strongest aspects of Final Fantasy V. The combat's not the only area in which I located stuff that was referring to Final Fantasy V. A lot of the enemies present in Final Fantasy XVI have only really been found in Final Fantasy V rather than characters like Moogles or Marlboros or Behemoths that are found across the entire franchise. So there are enemies like the Cray Claws and the Kala boss, which are bosses from Final Fantasy V that have been translated into more regular enemies in Final Fantasy XVI, and the Liquid Flame boss was also present in Final Fantasy XIV, but is first shown in Final Fantasy V as a boss at the end of the burning ship. So there's little references here and there to most Final Fantasies throughout the bestiary of FF16, but FF5 definitely made its influence clear here as well. Continuing on the train of thought with enemy designs and recurring enemies, obviously we have a ton of different ones like your Behemoths, etc., as I said, but there's one that is a recurring character in Final Fantasy games, most notably Final Fantasy VI, that appears in FF16, however, in an extremely different guise, and that's Typhon. So Typhon in Final Fantasy VI was kind of this big pink blob-looking monster. He also returns in later games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy 13-2. He obviously appears in Final Fantasy XIV. He's often put alongside Ultros, which is again a very, very popular monster from Final Fantasy VI, but in Final Fantasy XVI he's shown as like an eldritch horror from the beyond, And it's a very, very different take on Typhon, but his status as a summon previously has implications as to what he may or may not be within Final Fantasy XVI's world. And I find that to be a very interesting thing to take away as an influence from previous Final Fantasies. Now this next point, I'm going to put a big old spoiler warning across the screen right now, because the thing I'm going to be discussing that has definitely got roots in other Final Fantasy games prior to 16 is the ending. So if you have not finished Final Fantasy 16, feel free to stop the video now. You are welcome to watch the other sections of this video which do not contain spoilers, but I'm going to be discussing the ending in this section of the video. Now that that warning is out of the way, the ending for Final Fantasy XVI is highly ambiguous in its nature. Whether certain characters live or die, whether certain characters are still present at the end, what actually happens in that post-credit sequence where things have moved on from time and magic is no longer a thing, that there's a book that's been written by a character that's meant to not be around anymore. It's very ambiguous, and this is something that has happened in many Final Fantasy games prior to 16. Final Fantasy VIII is probably the best example I can think of for this, where there's so much interpretation to the ending of Final Fantasy VIII, whether Ultimecia succeeded with time compression, whether Squall is even alive for the majority of the game. Final Fantasy Lightning Returns does this, where Lightning is transported to a world that may or may not be the real world, quote unquote. Then you've also got Final Fantasy 15, which has multiple different interpretations of how that's ended, and multiple actual interpretations of how it's ended, whether you've read the book, whether you've done the DLC. Basically what I'm getting at is that Final Fantasy 16 opens the door for questions to be asked by the viewer or the player, and this is something that Final Fantasy has had a trend of doing for a really long time. Before we continue, don't forget to look at all of my social links in the description box below, including Twitter, Twitch, Discord, and Patreon. On Twitch, I stream 4 days a week, including Final Fantasy, of course, and some of my favourite games, including Street Fighter, which I've got some very exciting stuff coming up for, and Zelda, now with added crowd control. So if you want to chat about this video or any other I make with me, then come pop down and say hi. I love meeting new people. I also have a Patreon where I provide additional benefits to people who support the channel. As a full-time creator, this means the absolute world to me, and I have many thanks to all of the people who you can see on this list of cards, which I make by hand, and I also give a shout out to one random patron every time I release a video, and today that person is going to be Multiracial Lion, who has been a very long supporter of mine. I'm extremely grateful. In that same interview where Final Fantasy V was cited as the favourite Final Fantasy by the developers of Final Fantasy XVI, the producer, Naoki Yoshida, or Yoshi P as he's more well known, has also described FF16 as a similar experience to what he experienced when he played the very first Final Fantasy, describing it as playing the lead in an epic motion picture. So Final Fantasy XVI definitely takes that role and puts you through the eyes of Clive and the characters surrounding him as he explores Valisthea and all of the themes and characters that go along with it. So the last game that I want to bring up in this list of influences on Final Fantasy XVI is actually Final Fantasy Tactics. If you've played Final Fantasy Tactics, you'll know that the story is highly political in nature, with warring factions, warring nations. It's called the War of the Lions for a start, and there being such nuance to characters that can be dealt with in a very human way. Like, Ophelia is being told that she's a double for the real Princess Ophelia who died years ago. There's lots of parallels between Tactics and FF16 that come forward through this kind of storytelling. A lot of people say, oh, it's Game of Thrones, it's very influenced by Game of Thrones. But Final Fantasy Tactics has been doing that kind of storytelling for a really long time, and predates certainly the TV show for Game of Thrones. So instead of perhaps looking at the obvious influences on a game like FF16, and that's not to say that it's not influenced by Game of Thrones, it almost certainly is, but there's more to it than that. And if you like the story of Final Fantasy XVI and you want to explore something that's like it, but honestly probably even more in depth in a lot of ways, perhaps consider exploring Final Fantasy Tactics. You won't be disappointed. So that's all on today's video on the various influences that previous Final Fantasy games have had on Final Fantasy 16, all backed up with research and my own experience with those games as well. Is there a game that perhaps I've missed on this list that you'd like me to discuss in a future video on its influence on Final Fantasy 16 or the gaming sphere in general, or maybe you'd like a video similar to this that has nothing to do with Final Fantasy at all? Let me know in the comments below, and of course don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click that bell for notifications on any future videos I might be making. It's very helpful for the dreaded YouTube algorithm, so I appreciate it endlessly if you enjoy this content and you'd like to continue to follow what I'm doing. Don't forget to join up on my Discord channel where we can continue the conversation there. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy FF16 and the rest of the franchise if you haven't played it already. I may be making a video for which Final Fantasy I'd recommend if 16 was your first and you're now looking for a second one. So look forward to that, and I will see you next time, beautiful. Have a great day. Bye.